Thank you so much, Emma. I want to start by just expressing my profound thanks to my dear friend Emma Saperstein and the SLO Museum of Art. It was Emma's idea, as she said, to host this reading. When she saw that the book came out, she contacted us and said, let me get some copies for the museum library. We can be the local vendor for the book. And then she said, you know what, we should do a reading. And I was so happy to be able to do that. It's so meaningful to be back here in San Luis Obispo, in particular for this event. The novelist Thomas Wolfe said, "You can't go home again." That was the title of one of his novels. But we're here back home with Tenny tonight. We visited her grave earlier today. She's at the cemetery off Higuera, and it's just especially relevant to be here in San Luis Obispo for all of us, which is kind of the crucible in which we were all formed and where we grew up. We moved here in 1992 when Tenny was 18 months old. I was 4, and we were all homeschooled until high school by my parents who are here, and I'm going to talk about what is so significant about the achievement of this book of Tenny's, which I'll just say right now, when the first edition of the book was published in 2021 in Armenian, these were poems written in Armenian, it was actually the first full-length volume of creative literature, fiction or poetry, to be published in the Armenian language by someone who was born in this country. So, and that's coming from someone who didn't know the language growing up. We didn't speak Armenian growing up. We learned at UCLA, as I'll talk about. Armenians have been in the U.S. since the late 1800s, active community. Lots of books have published here. I work at a library center in New York that has lots of books, but always by people who were born in another country and came to the U.S. She's the first author to produce something creative in this country. And that's especially significant for the history of Armenians because if you know anything about the sort of modern history of Armenians, it hasn't been a pretty one. And there's less and less ability to sort of live in the traditional homeland that Armenians have lived in. And so it's a diasporic experience and reality that Armenians have. And so if you can't continue to create creatively, you don't have a living culture really anymore. You just have a museum or a relic or something that looks towards the past that you lost. But what Tenny has shown is that Armenian culture, Armenian language can survive and thrive in the diaspora in a new place. And actually, her book and her work has already had a revolutionary impact on the way Armenian is taught at UCLA. So she wrote the book, the works in this poem she wrote the poems in this book while she was at UCLA. When she went to UCLA, she didn't know Armenian, she learned there. And in the second year of classes, she started writing these poems kind of as assignments in the class. They would read literature, philosophy, poetry, and she would write these sort of creative responses. And they were so good that her teacher, Hagop Galugian, who was the editor of the first book, said, you have a book here. And so they worked together to get that ready, and the book was basically ready to be published. This was in 2013, 2014, but She died in a car accident before that could happen in the summer of 2015. And then, of course, time passed, and her book finally came out in 2021. And since that time, we had been very eager to also have a bilingual edition of her work so that it could reach a wider audience, and those who don't know Armenian could read and appreciate her poetry. I mentioned this sort of revolutionary impact her poetry's had at UCLA. Her professor, Hagop Glugian, spoke at an online book launch we did a few weeks ago and talked about how, through his experience with Tenny, he crystallized this approach that he refers to as creative literacy. So usually when you learn a language, you're kind of this passive recipient who's just trying to, be able to gain fluency enough to speak with people and read, and you don't think of at first that someone who is a new learner of a language could be a real active contributor to that culture. Although there are other cases in literary history of what is referred to as exophony, a fancy Greek word that means writing in a language that isn't your native language, producing creative work in a language that isn't your native language. So Joseph Conrad, for example, for English, and there's other examples. Tenny is one of the first to go from a majority language to a minority language. Usually it's the other way around. She wrote much more poetry in English than in Armenian. And in my estimation, her English poetry is at a much higher level, an even more profound level, because you see like her full resources at work. But there's something about these poems in Armenian, we were talking earlier, that makes them so powerful because they are so profound in their content and ideas, while at the same time being couched in the most simple, direct, and kind of even sparse language and sentences. And that's partly a result of this background that I'm talking about, which is that she's writing in a language that not only is not her native language, but she'd only started learning, 12 months previously. I talk about this in the foreword, that it's almost unbelievable when you read them to think, like, there's no way that she wrote this, after 12 months of starting to learn this language. So I had her teacher send me scans of all the drafts of her poems so I could see for myself. And indeed, so the writing process that she had was she would write the poem in Armenian. You can find some pictures in the book showing a few of her drafts of her poems. And then she would make this kind of literal English translation. And the point of that translation was to be able to express what her intended meaning was in the Armenian, so her teacher could know, was she saying in Armenian what she was intending to say, and make corrections based on that. And it really was kind of the extent of the editing process. They were composed in Armenian, and I have the honor of having my name on the title page as the co-translator with Tenny, because I took her English language drafts and kind of refined them, or did a little modifying where it was so literal that just make it a little more poetic or whatever. But I basically stuck to her drafts. There was just one poem that she hadn't translated to English that I translated. So since this book has come out, I was mentioning her professor kind of changed this approach to teaching, where he developed a whole new class that is called Creating and Producing in Armenian. so that all these, Armenian sort of heritage speakers who go to UCLA are in the classes, and they're not just, reading great works and trying to master the language, but are responding creatively to what they're writing, whether it's poetry or making like podcasts or YouTube video or all this stuff. For Armenians, and this is especially significant because this form of Armenian that Tenny wrote in and was our family language, and also Talar and her aunt who are here tonight, called Western Armenian, this was the language spoken by those in the Ottoman Empire, where there's now basically no more Armenians living. And the language in 2010 was declared an endangered language by UNESCO because there's no nation where this language is spoken. It doesn't have, a kind of nation state behind it, schools, institution. Everything is just the community and diaspora trying to, make things happen. And so her work is very significant in that regard too, to kind of turn a new page and a new chapter that isn't just past looking, isn't just about tragedy and sadness and what, the horrible things that happen, but is about life and beauty and creativity and depth in the present where she is. You can read this book, and there's very little sort of Armenian content in it. It was written in this Armenian language, but that was just the vehicle of Tenny's creative expression for what she was doing. And I'm so glad that to be presenting here and have her book start to go out, beyond the Armenian community and into a more general readership that can appreciate the works on their own terms. Before going to UCLA, Tenny went to Cuesta College. And when she was there, she, I think, really started developing her creative writing. And in 2011, she won the first prize in the literary competition at Cuesta College that happens every year for fiction and poetry for the Tellus Literary Journal that they have at Cuesta. My mom's going to talk about how she never told anyone about any of her accomplishments or success, and was so kind of self-effacing about what she did. But yeah, I think I said enough at the outset here, and we have a really rich program. So we're going to have a few different readers who are going to come. So my dad, my mom, and my older sister, Faith. And then we're honored to have a couple other guests who I'll introduce later who are going to speak about the poetry from a literary perspective. You'll see and hear from me more in a little bit, but let me now invite my father, Tim Arlen, to come and read a couple of Tenny's poems, the ones that have kind of specifically an Armenian sort of bent. So it's our dad that's Armenian, not our mom, so I thought it'd be great to hear those poems from our dad.
Thank you for your introduction, Jesse. Trying to get situated here, kind of a wobbly stand. I'm really hoping that my emotions won't overwhelm my reason, and I'll be able to keep a few clear ideas in my head to be able to share some important and interesting things about Tenny and her beautiful writing. First, I'd also like to just say a few thank yous. Tremendous thank yous go out to you, Jesse. I don't have words to express how grateful I am and all of us are for the tremendous work you've done in spearheading the publication of her book and also the many presentations we've had in the aftermath of that, and also for this evening. I also want to thank Emma and the Museum of Art, Paul, Kevin, my family who's presenting a little bit later on, and all of you for coming out tonight and honoring our daughter by your presence. Special thanks go to Tammy, who together with me made 6 beautiful children. Very talented children. Never in my wildest dreams or darkest dreams would I have associated the word posthumous with one of my kids. But that's where we are. It's futile to ask why. We don't always get answers to our why questions. But our faith is firm. We believe in our Lord Jesus Christ and the life that he lived and the sacrifice that he made and his promise of eternal life to those who would believe. And we know that we will see our Tenny again. So that gives us hope and gives us reason to have joy tonight, despite the underlying difficulty and tragedy that we still bear. I have great joy and pride in my Tenny and her provocative writings, and I'm happy to be able to be here to share some of that with you. And if, of course, again, there is that sadness, but I think I will be able to share this with you in an exciting and interesting way. I've been asked to read a poem. The title is Here, There. I really love this poem because I can relate very strongly with it. In this poem, Tenny's describing really her identity crisis, growing up a bicultural person. And her experience is very much like mine. I also grew up biculturally, and any of you who did so can, I think, relate to this poem very, very well. I, as Tenny, was Armenian, am Armenian in my personal life, but in my public life, American. That caused no end of confusion for me as a young person growing up. I didn't know whether I was American, Armenian, or something else. And it turns out, I think, I was something else. And Tenny also was something else, something different. In this poem, you will hear 3 Armenian phrases. As Jesse said, we didn't speak Armenian in the home. I know few phrases even to this day. But I did say a few phrases throughout the years to our kids. And I think they, obviously, Tenny picked up on a few of those. And so you will hear Eshu Kuluch. Those who are Armenian are already laughing. It means donkey head, okay? I have no idea where she learned that from me, except for maybe those early mornings when I drove her to school behind terrible high school drivers. So maybe, I don't know. The other phrase you'll hear is Hosyegur, which means come here. And then the third phrase, I'm glad I taught her this one, Yes Kezi Gasirem, which means I love you. So the poem is Here, There, and listen to how Tenny relates her experience of growing up and living the bicultural experience. I was a little girl, and I wanted to know who I was in this world. I was always living between 2 worlds, my father's and my mother's. I remember how I thought when I was a young girl. My mother's world was American. Pancakes for dinner, rebelling against parents, seeing friends more than family. My father's world was Armenian. Large noses, different foods, giving respect to parents. Family was always first. Little words, eshu kuluch, hos yegur, yes kezi gesirem. So I looked at Armenians with American eyes, and I looked at Americans with Armenian eyes. I could not feel what Americans were feeling because I was not really American. And I could not speak Armenian because I was not really Armenian. I was a little girl, and I wanted to know who I was in this world. I was always living between two worlds, my father's and my mother's. I was a little girl, and the word I had in my soul was wanderer. I have also been asked to read a prose selection of one of Tenny's works, and the title of that reading is Antap. Antap, as some of you may know, is the former name of the present-day Turkish city of Gaziantep. And Antap was the birthplace, the hometown, shall we say, of my grandfather Vartan. Vartan was a big figure in my life. He told me many stories of the old country. And I, in turn, told those stories to our children through the years. These stories, as Jesse alluded to, were primarily about the suffering of the Armenian people, the persecutions at the hand of the Ottoman Turks. And my own grandfather has a really terrifying story that makes up part of that larger story. Many years ago, when I was serving as a missionary with the organization Be World, I had a chance to visit Gaziantep. And I wanted to go there particularly to just kind of see what my grandfather's hometown was like. So when I got there, one of the first things that I noticed up on the hill overlooking the city was the great citadel, frowning down upon the city. And that made a big impression upon me, and I came back and I shared that with the kids. You'll hear about that in Tenny's writing. Tenny, obviously being the literary artist, took artistic license and tells the story the way she perceives it and the way she understood it. And I want to read that to you right now. When my dad was little, his grandfather would tell him stories about their family. Years later, when I was little, my father would tell me these same stories about our family. I don't know a lot about my family and where we came from, but I know a little. Mostly I know about my family like a dream, very elusive and ambiguous. My father's father was born in Aleppo before the genocide. My father's grandmother was born in Harput, and her husband, Vartan by name, was born in Antap. I know that Antap had a large citadel, and in truth, that is all I know about my family. But I can imagine many things about Antap. The air always smelled like coriander and sumac. There the water was the best. It always resembled roses. But like a dream, these abstract ideas are neither real nor true. And in truth, I don't know a thing. Vartan, why didn't you tell us more stories? Maybe because you knew that if we are too busy with the past, we won't look to the future. Maybe you wanted it like this. One of the things, I'll just say in closing, that my grandfather taught his children was, you're in America now, be an American. So he guided his children to really look towards that future. And so I think Tenny somehow, in the relating of the stories in our home, she understood that. And she writes that in the last part of this writing. thank you again for being here and honoring our precious girl.
Thank you, Dad. It was very powerful to hear those poems, which I've read many times, read in your voice. I'm now so happy to be able to introduce my friend, Paul McCullough. I met Paul through someone else who's here tonight, Ken Walker, who's a retired philosophy professor at Cal Poly, and has had a huge impact on my life, the life of Faith and Tenny as well, my sisters, through introducing us to great books, specifically great books of philosophy and the depth in them. I started going to that group when I was in high school, and Tenny did after me, and it was really powerful to be introduced in that way. So a lot of lasting friendships came from that group, and one of those was Paul. Paul did his undergrad here at Cal Poly, and then he pursued a master's in English at the University of Iowa and went on to Yale Divinity School for an MAR in theology. He then stayed on the East Coast teaching at the Westover School, an all-girls boarding school in Middlebury, Connecticut. And then in 2015, 10 years ago, he came back to San Luis Obispo to take a position as teacher of literature at the SLO Classical Academy. I love the fact that Paul teaches at the Classical Academy in the Great Books program. To me, it's a connection in some ways also with our kind of homeschool upbringing, which was also very Great Books focused and kind of just doing things in a way that was off the beaten path. This book that Tenny wrote, in the sort of responses people have written about it from the Armenian side, they call her a pioneer and a trailblazer, for doing what she did. And I find in some way that comes out of the sort of homeschool experience of just being comfortable with being off the beaten path, doing things that no one else maybe has done before or others haven't done. When we were homeschooled in the 90s, it was kind of the as other people would say, the freaks and weirdos, were homeschooled. Not us, of course. Now it's the fastest growing form of schooling in the country, and we're kind of in a K-12 revolution right now as homeschooling went from being less than 1% of the population, when we were up to, it's 5% now, and kind of exponentially rising, as is also charter schools and private schools and Great Book schools. So I'm looking forward so much to hearing from my friend, Paul McCullough. So, Paul.
Thanks, Jesse. It's an honor. River inside the river. World within the world. All we have is words to reveal the rose that the rose obscures. Poetry is so many things, and it does so many things. Who can generalize about it? With an impossible number of caveats, then, perhaps as many caveats as there are poets, I submit for your consideration, at Jesse's request, a sort of primer for hearing Tenny's poems tonight. The matter has already been most succinctly condensed, for me at least, by this quintain, this 5-line poem you just heard from Gregory Orr, River Inside the River, in which poetry is positioned as language that reveals spirit. Language that reveals spirit. The world within the world. The way things only appear to us, so successfully disguised as themselves. There is another world, wrote Rainer Maria Rilke, one of Tenny's many muses, but, he continues, it's the same as this one. He's got a point, Rilke. The language that reveals spirit is almost never abstract or otherworldly. As you will hear in Tenny's poems tonight, it says things like willow, oak, lake, swan, mother, father, daughter. Things of this world that move us and delight us, and finally resist us, and which will always mean more than we can say. But poetry shows us the ways that matter has mattered to another, in a way that matters now, again, with the sudden force of revelation to us, the reader. Here I want to follow a hint in one of Tenny's favorite artworks. You're holding a version of it in your hands. Gustav Klimt's Beethoven Frieze, so luminously laid out on the cover by Megan Arlen. As with much of Klimt's work, the frieze draws on techniques of ancient Byzantine iconography. Do you see it? The gold leaf, the symbolic figure flattened against an unadorned two-dimensional background plane, the stylized suggestion of inspired ecstatic visions beyond the literal. To read Tenny's poems, I believe, is an invitation to what we might want to call iconic seeing. That is to say, along with the ancient and medieval thinkers, Tenny's other set of pre-modern muses, that matter is the form spirit takes, the house of being, and therefore all matter participates in the holy. In the language of Armenian Orthodoxy, to see iconically is not to see pure spirit or to see God himself. What would that even mean? It is rather to see all things in God, all things shining with the original light of their creation. This iconic seeing is, for me, an ever-present aspect of Tenny's poems. In Klimt's frieze, however, we cannot miss the bandeau, fashioned around the lyricist's head. A piece of headgear iconic now in a different sense, which we would instantly recognize as belonging to the proto-modernist Art Nouveau movements of the century's turn. The flapper muse hybrid evokes a spirit of art for art's sake, which also animates Tenny's book. Remember the old F. Scott Fitzgerald collection, Flappers and Philosophers. Tenny read her way to an unlikely common ground that the French symbolists and decadents shared with the ancient Hebrew sages and scriptures, the place where what the philosopher Iris Murdoch calls the absolute for-nothingness of the work of art emulates the radically free, gratuitous act of God's "let there be," and there was. Or to put it another way, to say, as I have said, that poetry is language that reveals spirit is not to say that poets like Tenny write to reveal spirit. Poets write, it seems, for every reason and for no reason at all, because they can, because we are free, because sometimes you just feel like singing. You must sing in order to be found, Lee Young Lee says, and when found, you must sing. Tenny felt this imperative in every aspect of her being, in the mornings of sunshine and in the evenings of shadow. It's there in the book. Surely poetry is not the only medium in which we can sing. Surely words are not all we have to reveal the rose that the rose obscures. And just as surely, poetry so often does the exact opposite of what I've just been claiming for it. Poetry is also a concealer, a keeper of secrets. It is language allied with silence, with the unsaid, with the mostly empty space of the page surrounding it. Poetry conceals as much as it reveals, and perhaps this is why we instinctively trust it with so much of our secret selves. Thomas Merton once wrote that a person is a person insofar as he has a secret and is a solitude of his own that cannot be communicated to anyone else. If I love a person, Merton explains, I will love that which most makes him a person: the secrecy, the hiddenness, the solitude of his own individual being, which God alone can understand. I want to end then with a short poem about hiddenness, which is a dialectical impulse I also feel running through Tenny's book. This one is written by another person I both know and don't really know at all. Christian Wyman, who for one life-altering decade or so suddenly and improbably found himself installed as the editor-in-chief of Poetry magazine, while at the same time falling in love, fathering twin girls, and being diagnosed with a grim and incurable form of blood cancer, a matter of when, not if, his doctors explained. Late at night in the basement offices of a Chicago office building, as Chris tells it, he would read through reams and reams of the magazine's rejected poems, going back 100 years, some of them, each one a message in a bottle that never washed ashore in another mind. Given the near total certainty that none of the poems we write, none of the memories we make, none of the lives we live will stick around very long, a generation or three, if we're lucky and beloved, a few dozen generations maybe if you write like Shakespeare. What can something so insubstantial, so hidden as a poem really mean or matter? I hope you'll see why I thought of Tenny here as I read these closing lines, with their quiet, clear-eyed faith in the abiding mysteries of language, beauty, and being. And why tonight I'm so grateful to Jesse, to Emma, to the Arlens for putting together this book, this reading. Because sometimes all we have are words and the silences that surround them. Chris's poem to close my remarks is called Varieties of Quiet. Varieties of Quiet. I quote from a poet no one knows, and no one knows me too. If by chance, happening here, some far year, when I am not, it matters, I tell you. It matters, the matter one mind collects, one memory protects. When memories kin to that wordless feeling, words open in your head. Varieties of quiet. Varieties of quiet. There are many, friend, as many as the dead.
Wow, Paul, thank you so much. That was so beautiful. I think everyone's feeling jealous right now of the students in your classes at SLOMA that get to listen to you on a regular basis. I'm glad that was recorded so I can listen to it again. Thank you for such a profound and meaningful reflection on poetry and on what you saw in Tenny's work. I'm now so happy to be able to invite my older sister, Faith, to come read. In our birth order, Faith is a couple years older than me. I'm a couple years older than Tenny. And Faith was just the creative and artistic inspiration and model for Tenny and I our entire lives. That was our guide into the realm of fairyland and beauty and the imagination and make-believe. And I remember being a little kid and just sitting mesmerized, listening to Faith's stories she would tell and the make-believe worlds that she would create for us. And there's a way in which that me and Tenny have never left those that creative world of the imagination that you introduced us to. And I'll leave the podium so that you can come up now to read Tenny's work, Faith.
I was going to try not to cry, but I'm already failing. I didn't really prepare anything to say, more I just wanted to read, but I did want to just say how proud I am of, both of my siblings, for Tenny and Jessie, and just every move forward that her art makes, my heart just like grows in pride and just thankfulness that she's still blooming and touching so many people, which is her soul's purpose, and she's serving it so profoundly, even as she rests. And I was thinking one other thing when I was sitting there. It feels appropriate that I didn't prepare, because I feel like, along with Tenny, I resonate so deeply with, with art's purpose that's just so beautiful and powerful. And I was picturing like silver fingers that can reach into a spirit and remove or rearrange something, like without you even noticing. And I feel Tenny's power so strongly to be able to do that to so many spirits, even as she's gone. And I'm grateful she's able to accomplish so much even now. So this is her first poem called Swans. I'm going to take a couple deep breaths, try to get through it. It's a 3-part poem, and I won't share my own thoughts, but I hope that those silver fingers have their effect in you as you listen. So 1. There was a silver lake in the woods, alone, isolated, protected, without buildings, without people. Its home was furnished with wild ferns and weeping willows, and large oak trees were its roof. When I found that silver lake for the first time, it was an autumn day. There was a silence, there was a peace, which from the trees and from the ground rose up like mist. I was young then, and life's anxiety, life's despair did not appear on my face. 2. This is page 69, by the way, if anyone wants to read. Slowly I came to the lake, under the oaks and between the willows, until I stopped at the lake's shore. 7 swans floated on the water with circular movements, all in unison, all full of grace. 3. It is autumn again, and those swans on the silver lake still swim in my mind in circles, in circles. This quiet building is my house, and this cold wood is my ceiling. My hands hold nothing, and no one. And my life is filled with empty glass teacups and dusty windowsills. So in my house, walking in circles, I will recite poetry to forget the time that shatters teacups, that breaks windowsills. Time that places nothing in my hands. I will recite. I can stop time. Oh, swans, swans. I'm also reading one more that's a little prose piece of hers that I deeply believe in. Thank you. I remembered the book, but not the tissues. That's just kind of her perspective on creativity and poetry that's, to me, like, I think when I read at her funeral, my piece that I wrote basically was saying the same thing, and that made me so happy because our passions were so similar, I think. Poet. This is page 129, if anybody. God created the world not for any hidden motive or reason, but only for creation. The true poet is similar. She writes not because of a need to promote anything or anyone, but the poet writes for the sake of creation. Because in this world filled with hate, fear, murder, and destruction, creation is good. Creation is healing. Creation is indispensable. God did not create for a rational reason. And similarly, the poet wants to escape life's rational, constructed perceptions that the world gives to her. To write poetry only for its creation is to look through the soul. To want to write a poem because the soul has a need for it is to be like God.
Thank you, Faith, for that beautiful and powerful reading. It's now my honor to be able to introduce someone who we're so grateful is with us here tonight to speak about Tenny and her poetry, and it's Cal Poly Professor Emeritus of English and former co-director of the Creative Writing Program at Cal Poly, poet Kevin Clark. He's the author of 3 poetry collections, most recently The Consecrations, which was the winner of the Elena Miles Weber Todd Poetry Series book competition, or actually that was for his second book of poetry, Self-Portrait with Expletives. He's also earned poetry grants from the Academy of American Poets and won the Angoff Award for other poetry and other fellowships. And for 2 years, starting in 2020, he was the Poet Laureate here in San Luis Obispo. He was also Faith's poetry professor, English professor at Cal Poly, and we went to high school together with his kids at SLO High. His son was the best actor I've ever seen at our high school. We were, He also, for those that have an interest in writing and poetry, is the author of a very well-received textbook on writing poetry called The Mind's Eye, A Guide to Writing Poetry. And he spends his summers teaching at writing workshops and writing poetry. And thank you so much for agreeing to be here tonight, Professor Clark.
Well, I'd like to thank Faith, especially for contacting me about this night, and the Arden family, and of course Emma and the museum. which is a spectacular space for this place, for this event, I think, right? I have to say before I start that Faith, I don't know how many years ago it was, Faith, but I recall how good your work was, right? And Faith, like Tenny, was a terrific poet when she was in my class. And I want to thank her not only for inviting me to be here tonight, but to say a few words and to introduce me to what I'll call the complex, mytho-Christian, slightly tinged, elegiac poems of Tenny Arlen. Right? So I'm going to speak of themes tonight, but I'm not unaware of Tenny's clear talent for technique and structure. I'm not going to be talking about them. I'll mention it maybe here and there. And I'm going to be quoting now and then, and I'll try to indicate when I'm quoting. And you've heard a lot already about what I'm going to quote. So, I've been reading To Say with Passion, Why Am I Here? For a few weeks. And from the first, I was struck by Tenny Arlen's reaching after the ineffable. That is, her desire for a realm that cannot quite be described in words. The irony is that while she realizes this realm is virtually beyond reach of the living, she can describe not only the literary and psychic operations of her own search for it, but also its imagined tenor. I confess I know nothing of the Armenian language or Ukrainian verse. I can tell you that my own grandfather came over from Sicily, and there were times, I think, where my mother was caught between two worlds. I am, however, intimately familiar with the great English poets of the last 150 years. Tenny's poems recall not only William Butler Yeats, but also T.S. Eliot and Rainier Rilke, both of whom she mentions in her work. Like Tenny, all three sought something akin to the divine. Just as Yeats conceived of a mystic vision in much of his work, and Eliot strove to depict the domain of spirit in the four quartets, and Rilke rendered the vast, uncharted world of inner space in the Duino elegies, Tenny sojourns after a region that may be outside of time and the mechanisms of human thought. In fact, her poetics is laid out in her prose poem, which we've heard, Poet. God did not create for a rational reason, and similarly, the poet wants to escape life's rational, constructed perceptions that the world gives to her. God did not create for a rational reason, and similarly, the poet wants to escape life's rational, constructed perceptions that the world gives to her. That's a pretty good poetics if I've ever heard one, right? It's clear throughout this book that Tenny wishes to live via acts of creation a life made more divine by untethering herself from the constraints of rationality. That's why Tenny's poems can seem at times so dreamlike, so removed from the tactile things of this world. In her poem that's column-shaped, You Were, she searches for a being, or perhaps more accurately, a beingness, and finds a personified version of this potential. Though the second person you never appears in flesh or voice, it watches her amidst the beauty. That is to say, this other dimension exists. And in her enumerated sequential poem, Swans, she declares, "I will write poetry to forget the time." In Tenny's polemic, time itself is cast along with the rational into the category of the useless and unhelpful. She always seeks to be without being burdened by the quotidian qualities of the physical life. And so, in perhaps the most remarkable poem of this volume, the enumerated sequence Stillborn, Tenny sees herself as pregnant with possibility. She is a vessel capable of reaching out of her present consciousness for something other. In a dramatically successful poetic gambit, she sees herself embedded in a kind of infinite present, describing herself in both the first and second person pronouns, dancing trance-like to the now. She longs for the moment when the I can be birthed into what I will call a more divinated you. But because the other near realm is nonetheless unreachable in our present state, she sees herself finally as stillborn, as we all must be. Let me turn to a kind of paradox, as perhaps the poet herself would. Tenny Arlen has given us a courageous poetry of spiritual realism. Like other poets who have died far too young, Sylvia Plath comes to mind quickly, we are deprived of the kind of yet more mature visionary work. It is, though, our privilege to have so much belletristic and metaphysical excellence in the form of this remarkable volume. To answer the book's title, we can say that Tenny was here, among many reasons, to give us the deep pleasure of transformative reading.
Thank you so much, Professor Clark. It's so powerful to hear Tenny's poetry analyzed in such a perceptive and revealing way by someone who's not just a professor of literature, but a poet yourself. I think it's a mark of true, you've created something really great when it doesn't exist on its own as beauty, but also gives rise to further beauty and acts of creation. You spoke about how Tenny read so deeply of these other poets and kind of synthesized them and created her own poetry. Her poetry, in turn, has given rise to other creative works already in a couple years. One of those is a composition, a classical music composition by a young composer named Adin Shahjahanian. He composed a piece of music using words from Tenny's poem Stillborn that Professor Clark referred to. He called it Heri, which in Armenian means pregnant. And he kind of chose the words and arranged them for voice, clarinet, and piano. And he submitted this to an international music competition that took place in Armenia in 2024, and it won second prize. And you can hear it on YouTube. He also premiered it later in the year in Los Angeles at another music festival. My mom is going to read that poem as one of her 2 poems. And so, so happy to invite up to speak my mom, who was our language and English teacher in homeschool. And like Tenny, who hid her poems and never talked about herself, Mom, too, is a great writer, both of fiction and poetry and nonfiction, and she also hides her writing, but hopefully not for, for long. So, Mom.
It's not a very sophisticated way to say it, but I'm blown away by the gift of everyone's presence here, by the words that have been spoken about my beloved daughter, who I miss so much, and I also want to add my thanks, especially to Emma for hosting this for us, for planning it so beautifully in this room full of very resonant art that goes with Tenny's poetry so well, I think. I want to thank Paul and Dr. Clark for their rich, rich words of acclaim for Tenny, and making beautiful comparisons between her work and people's who would make her either blush or roll her eyes if she knew. But I appreciate it so much. Tenny was the 5th child in a line of very academically, and some more than others, creatively gifted older siblings. And she was very insecure about her own giftedness and talent, and had the misfortune of always looking up to and comparing herself with people who were above her, and she always felt inferior. And I would tell her, I would take time to tell her how talented she was, but I was dismissed because I was just her mom, But she especially, respected deeply and admired both Faith and Jesse's talent for poetry, and never felt like she was running in the same pack with them. And so when she was in high school and college, occasionally I would walk into her room and she'd have left a piece of poetry on her desk that she was working on. And I remember the first time that happened, and she came back into the room, and I said, with big eyes, because she'd hidden it so privately, "Tenny, this is really, really good." And she just grabbed it and, stuck it in the drawer. Don't look at that. And she just had such a hard time accepting her own giftedness. And I remember when she was at UCLA, and it was the second year, and she'd gone through Hagop's Armenian class, and now it was the year where they tried to use it creatively. And she called me up after class one day, and she said, Mom, do you know what Hagop said to me today? And I said, what? And she said, he told me, you're better than Jesse. And she so quickly, without a pause, added, it's like, you're better than Jesse. Of course that's not true, but wasn't that nice of him to say? So I think all the time, about how she would just be so in utter disbelief that this book was published. Thank you, Jesse, for your hard work in making that happen, and that people appreciate her art, so thank you. And Faith, I gotta say thank you for what Jesse said, the example that you were, the inspiration that you were to both Jesse and Tenny. It's so true. In the words of Tenny, we live by those who tell, who give a voice, who give breath in the immense silence. And that's what we're doing here tonight, is we're giving her a voice again, by being here, talking about her poetry and reading her poetry. The first poem I'm going to read is Professor Clark referenced it, is the poem You Were. It's on page 61. I found you. I was wandering around the flower bed. I would often go there to look at the beauty, to walk and think. Life in the flower bed was more delicate. Time walked with the sun, and the night never came, while flowers curled under the wind's warm breath. I only came for the flowers, to smell one here and there, perhaps to pick one or two. I was not searching for you, but you were in the petal's beauty, and each flower I picked your beauty. You silently watched me. You never spoke. You never moved, as the flowers will say, but you were there. You were there amidst the beauty. And just adding a little bit from my heart about that, I do think, as Professor Clark said, she was referencing the Creator and that beauty is an aspect of that nature of the Creator that's everywhere we look, if we have eyes to see. And when I now go to beautiful places, I think of that poem, and I also feel and see and perceive Tenny there amidst the beauty. My next poem to read is Stillborn. It's a poem in 3 parts. This one was written in English and translated by Jesse into Armenian. So you're going to notice a little upscale in sophistication level because she's writing in her native language. And so it's in 3 parts, so I'll pause before each part. Stillborn. 1. I am the inability. I carry it in me, a basket of unspoken words, ideas floating vaguely in the blue chaos of my I am. Pregnant, a life of words is forming, not as it should be. Limbs unaccounted spring, crooked, sharp teeth, 20 purple toes. To abort the growth is not to unthink. But to see who I am, this I see, this I am, sun through green leaves, speckle a sleeping cheek like glistening fish scales, while lilacs and jasmine blush scents to the wind. She carries them, singing, gently leaving their I am on the hair of weeping willows and on the white arms of birch trees. The moss on the rocks turn half a face away. The blue sky bows aside for a purple magnitude. Here I breathe, here I drink, here I am. Then, conceived and formed, shaped and molded, trained, conditioned, the birth of your own growth, laying neatly, ordered, arranged. Your I am is this, not my chaos. 2. Yet, I too can call. I can summon Orpheus, singing and composing fire, hand of divinity to bring the rest. I speak Rilke, Dickinson, Cummings. They carry the moon, angels and petals and time and space that sing the I am of me. Through Eliot and they gather the past, dancing trance-like to the now, giving life to the dead, the would-be forgotten, evocation of humanity. Do you understand this? 3. But my I ams, I am, facing your birthed, swaddled growth, groomed and healthy, eyes wide shut, and mouth open expectantly. This would-be scream screams no sound, souls unhearing, black impotence devouring. And though I know the stars will always hang each night, the whisper speaks in gray heather on green hills, and ocean shouting will always wane to murmuring. My I am, my growth is stillborn, and I am rendered voiceless. Thank you.
Thank you, Mom, for that beautiful reading. We did include 3 of Tenny's English language poems, or poems composed in English. She composed, as I mentioned, more works in English than Armenian, which we're hoping to publish in a later book. But when we made the first edition, we wanted to have a few of those in the original, with the Armenian poem, so you could kind of see connections between her creation in these 2 languages. It was actually Hagop, her professor at UCLA, that translated those 3 from Armenian, or from English to Armenian. It wouldn't be right to end this beautiful reading without hearing the original. And so I'm going to close by reading one of Tenny's poems, a poem that has come to mean so much to our family, as you'll see why. I'm going to read the Armenian first and then close with the English, and then Emma will say a couple words in closing. I mentioned that the poems were written after readings that were done in the courses, and they would read in the courses not just works of Armenian writers, but also works of philosophy or literature in Armenian translated too. So there's some poems or works that she wrote after reading Kant with his works on judgment, aesthetic judgment. This particular poem was written after reading a selection from Nietzsche on his idea about the eternal return of all things. And listen to how Tenny took that concept and kind of transformed it in her own way. You'll have to wait to the English. An verches skisp. Gyankis պատմությունը պիտի չվերջանա մահովս։ Երբ ծնա, Batmutunas eskasav. Martig gasan mezi vorj, orma bidimer nink. Paits jish che. Mergyankera shachanagneru besen. Nor batmutuner yevnoraskisner gudan, amen pani voru tupchink. Amen par vorgachosink, kichmenoraskispe. Amen par vorgakerenk, kichmenoraskispe. Amen par vorgagartank, nor chortma, gammut medukmene, mermud kerun mech. Musnerun noraskisner gudank chosalov, Yevkaralov. Yerp mernink, merhedkera gasharunagvin aiskyankin mech, Yevurish martots mech. Uramen, maha panavchikar mezi. Endless beginning. My life story will not end with my death. When I was born, my story began. People tell us that one day we will die. But this isn't true. Our lives are like circles, giving new stories and beginnings to each thing we touch. Every word we speak is a little new beginning. Each word we write is a little new beginning. Each word we read is a new thought or musing in our minds. We give new beginnings to others by speaking and writing. When we die, our traces continue in this life and in other people. Therefore, death never comes to us.
Thank you all so much. My heart is tender. I was just struck by the comments around hiddenness, and I just want to point out and leave it for you that that painting behind the videographer there is called Hollowness. So spend some time with it if you can. I'm going to park myself at the desk in the back so you can purchase your books if you so choose. And thank you again, and thank you to the family and everyone.